The check in my hand was worth $20,000. The signature on it, James Morrison, the same man who once humiliated me in front of 40 colleagues, snaring that I sounded like a cartoon character having a stroke. My name is Dr. Sofia Restrepo. 3 years ago, I was invisible, an immigrant woman mocked for her accent, crushed under laughter that sliced deeper than any blade. James Morrison's words hunted me, poisoned my confidence, and nearly destroyed my career. But scars have a way of hardening into armor. His cruelty became my fuel. I studied harder, worked longer, and refused to vanish. Every insult he hurled at me became another stone in the foundation of the empire I built. Now, I stand backstage at the Chicago Convention Center. 1,200 business leaders wait for me, the keynote speaker, the best-selling author, the authority on cross-cultural communication. And the man introducing me? James Morrison himself. He doesn't recognize me. He doesn't remember the damage he caused. But I remember every syllable. As I step into the spotlight, red heels striking the stage like war drums, I meet his eyes. For a heartbeat, I see confusion, then fear. This is not just payback. This is proof. The voice he tried to silence has become the voice that owns the room. And if you think this is the end of the story, stay tuned because this is only the beginning of how his cruelty became his downfall. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. Not in that Chicago Convention Center, but in a small apartment in Medellin, Colombia, where a 12-year-old girl named Sofia practiced English by reading American business magazines out loud to her reflection in the bathroom mirror. My father, Carlos, was an engineer who dreamed bigger than our circumstances allowed. My mother, Elena, cleaned houses for wealthy families while studying for her nursing degree at night. They saved every peso they could, dreaming of giving me opportunities they'd never had. Mija, my father would say, pointing to the skyscrapers in American movies, someday you will work in buildings like those, but first you must learn to speak like they do. So I learned. I devoured English like it was oxygen, watching dubbed American TV shows and reading business books I borrowed from the library. I practiced until my tongue cramped, until the sounds felt natural, until I could dream in English. When I was 19, we finally got our visas. America, the land of opportunity, where accents were supposed to be charming, where diversity was supposed to be strength. I enrolled at Northwestern University for International Business, working 3 jobs to pay for school while my parents started over in a country that didn't recognize their degrees. College was the first place I realized my accent wasn't seen as charming. It was seen as a limitation. Could you repeat that, please? Professors would say, even when I knew I'd spoken clearly. Classmates would smile politely and then ask someone else to explain what I'd just explained perfectly well myself. But I adapted. I softened my R's, flattened my vowels, practiced American idioms until they rolled off my tongue like I'd been born here. By graduation, I'd nearly erased the musical cadence of my homeland from my voice. Nearly. I landed my first job at Morrison and Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Chicago. James Morrison, the founder's son and VP of Client Relations, interviewed me himself. Impressive resume, he said, barely glancing up from the papers. Just one concern. Will clients be able to understand you clearly? Communication is crucial in this role. I demonstrated my English skills, answered his questions flawlessly, even threw in some industry jargon to prove I belonged. He hired me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We'll give it a try, he said, like he was doing me a favor instead of hiring the most qualified candidate. But I didn't know then that James had a reputation for testing employees he considered diversity hires. I didn't know then that he'd made similar comments to other immigrant colleagues, slowly chipping away at their confidence until they either quit or stayed silent. That was just the beginning of how systemic his prejudice really was. For 8 months, I was the model employee at Morrison and Associates. I worked 60-hour weeks, brought in 3 major clients, and exceeded every target they set for me. I thought I was proving myself, earning my place at that mahogany conference table. I thought wrong. The monthly all-hands meeting was held in the glass conference room on the 20th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. 40 employees hacked into that space, from junior analysts to senior partners, all waiting to hear about the company's new strategic direction. I'd prepared extensively for this meeting because James had asked me to present our proposal for expanding into the Latin American market. This was my moment, the chance to show that my background was an asset, not a liability. I stood up, clicked to my first PowerPoint slide, and began what I thought would be my career-defining presentation. Good morning, everyone. As you know, the Latin American market represents a tremendous opportunity for our firm. With my experience in cross-cultural communication and native understanding of these markets, I believe Morrison and Associates can. I was maybe 2 minutes in when I noticed the smirks, then the whispers. Then James Morrison's face twisted into something between amusement and disgust. Sophia, I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble following you. Could you slow down and maybe, I don't know, speak more clearly? The room fell silent. 40 pairs of eyes locked onto me, like I was a specimen under a microscope. I I thought I was speaking clearly, Mr. Morrison. That's when he did it. That's when James Morrison destroyed something inside me that I'm still rebuilding today. He turned to the room with this theatrical sigh and said, "Does anyone else feel like they need subtitles? Because Sophia sounds like a cartoon character having a stroke up there." The laughter started small. A few nervous chuckles from people who didn't know how else to react. But then it spread like wildfire. 40 people, people I'd worked beside for months, people I'd considered friends, laughing at the way I spoke, at the core of who I was. My face burned with shame so intense, I thought I might faint. The presentation slides blurred through tears I refused to let fall. Every word I'd practiced, every accomplishment I'd earned, every dream I'd carried from Medellin to this moment, all of it crumbled into nothing because of the way my tongue shaped English sounds. "Maybe," James continued, still playing to his audience, "maybe we should stick to markets where we can communicate without needing a translator." More laughter. Someone in the back actually applauded. I gathered my papers with hands that shook like leaves in a hurricane, mumbled something about technical difficulties, and fled that glass box of humiliation. I made it to the bathroom before I broke down completely, sobbing into my hands while the sound of laughter echoed in my memory. But I didn't know then that Susan Chen, the senior partner, hadn't laughed. I didn't know then that she'd been documenting James's behavior for months, building a case that would eventually reach the company's board of directors. I didn't know then that my humiliation had been witnessed by someone who would become the most unlikely ally in my quest for justice. That was just the beginning of how deeply his cruelty would cut and how powerfully I would heal. After the presentation disaster, I became a ghost in my own workplace. James Morrison had effectively branded me as incompetent with a single cruel joke, and the brand stuck like permanent ink. Colleagues who used to ask for my input suddenly stopped including me in conversations. Projects I'd been leading were quietly reassigned to other team members. When clients specifically requested to work with me, which happened more often than James cared to admit, he'd suggest they might prefer someone who could communicate more effectively. The worst part wasn't the professional isolation. It was the voice in my head that started sounding disturbingly like James Morrison. Maybe he's right. Maybe your accent really is unprofessional. Maybe you're fooling yourself thinking you belong here. I found myself practicing American pronunciation in my apartment until my throat was raw. I recorded myself speaking and played it back, wincing at every rolled R, every vowel that didn't sound quite right.
I started avoiding phone calls because I was terrified clients wouldn't understand me. The confident woman who'd stood up to present that day had been replaced by someone who apologized for speaking before she even opened her mouth. "Excuse me, sorry if this is hard to understand, but I think maybe we could consider." I was erasing myself one conversation at a time. My performance reviews reflected James's campaign of character assassination. Communication skills need improvement, may benefit from additional training in client interaction. He never mentioned the deals I'd closed or the clients who specifically praised my cultural insights. Just the thing he decided made me defective. My parents noticed the change during our weekly video calls. "Mija, why do you sound so tired?" my mother asked, her face creased with worry on the pixelated screen. I wanted to tell her about James, about the laughter, about how I was suffocating in a job that was supposed to be my American dream. Instead, I smiled and said work was fine, that I was busy with important projects. I couldn't bear to tell her that her daughter, the girl who'd fought so hard to master English, was now ashamed of the very voice that carried their hopes and sacrifices. But I didn't know then that shame was eating me alive from the inside out. I didn't know then that I'd started avoiding mirrors because I couldn't stand to see the defeat in my own eyes. The breaking point came 6 months later, during a client dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. Morrison and Associates was courting a major pharmaceutical company, and I'd been included in the meeting only because the client had specifically requested the woman with the South American expertise. I was explaining the regulatory landscape in Colombia when the client interrupted me. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Your accent is quite thick." Before I could respond, James jumped in with that same theatrical sigh I'd heard in the conference room. "You'll have to forgive Sophia. We're still working on getting her up to speed with American business communication standards." The client laughed, not cruelly, just politely, but the sound hit me like a physical blow. James had done it again, in front of a client, in front of the very people my expertise was supposed to impress. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my Northwestern diploma and wondering if coming to America had been the biggest mistake of my life. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. For a week, I couldn't force myself to walk back into that building where my voice, the voice my parents had sacrificed everything to help me find, was treated like a disability. But I didn't know then that my week of absence had triggered something unexpected. I didn't know then that Susan Chen had been watching everything, taking notes, building a case. I didn't know then that sometimes you have to disappear completely before you can figure out who you really are. That was just the beginning of my journey back to myself. The knock on my apartment door came on a Saturday morning while I was still in my nightsuit, contemplating whether I even wanted to keep working at Morrison and Associates. I'd been wallowing in self-doubt for 2 weeks, living on takeout and bad coffee, when Susan Chen appeared on my doorstep like some kind of corporate guardian angel. "Sophia, we need to talk." Susan was in her 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that made boardrooms fall silent when she spoke. She was a senior partner at the firm, someone I'd admired from afar but never imagined having a personal conversation with. "Miss Chen, I'm so sorry I've been out. I know I should have." She held up a hand. "You should have what? Stayed in that toxic environment while James Morrison systematically destroyed your competence? No, Sophia. You should have come to me months ago." She walked into my apartment like she owned it, glanced around at the takeout containers and crumbled tissues, and sat down at my kitchen table. "Tell me everything, and I mean everything." For the next 2 hours, I told her about the presentation, the laughter, the gradual erosion of my responsibilities, the way James had turned my accent into a weapon against me. With each story, Susan's expression grew darker.
Sophia, do you know what James said in the partners' meeting last week? I shook my head. He said the firm needed to be more careful about hiring people with communication challenges. He said diversity was important, but not at the expense of client satisfaction. He specifically mentioned your accent as an example of how good intentions could backfire. The betrayal hit me like a slap. Even when I wasn't there, he was still destroying my reputation. But here's what James doesn't know, Susan continued, pulling out her phone. I've been documenting everything. Every discriminatory comment, every client meeting where he's undermined you, every project he's reassigned based on your accent rather than your performance. She showed me a folder thick with emails, meeting transcripts, and witness statements. This is a federal discrimination case, Sophia. What James has been doing isn't just cruel, it's illegal. I stared at the evidence of my professional assassination, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Rage. Not the self-loathing shame that had been eating me alive, but clean, burning anger at the injustice of it all. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. Susan's smile was sad and knowing. Because 25 years ago, I was the only Asian woman in a law firm full of white men who thought my name was too hard to pronounce. They called me Susan because they couldn't be bothered to learn that my Chinese name meant pearl of wisdom. I know what it feels like to be made invisible by people who should know better. She leaned forward, her voice intense. But more than that, Sophia, I've seen your work. You're brilliant. Your cultural insights have saved this company from making million-dollar mistakes in international markets. Your accent isn't a flaw. It's proof that you're connected to a world these people don't understand and desperately need access to. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully. What do I do? First, you come back to work. Not because James Morrison deserves it, but because you deserve to take up space in that building. Second, you start speaking, really speaking, in meetings again. I'll be there to back you up. She stood to leave, then turned back with something that might have been a smile. And third, Sophia, you start remembering that the thing James Morrison is trying to destroy, that accent, that voice, that connection to your culture, that's not your weakness. That's your superpower. But I didn't know then that Susan had already contacted an employment attorney. I didn't know then that she'd been building a case that would eventually force Morrison and Associates to confront their systemic bias. Most importantly, I didn't know then that Susan's words would plant a seed that would grow into something James Morrison never saw coming. That was just the beginning of my transformation from victim to victor. Susan wasn't just offering moral support. She was offering me a chance to fight back. But fighting back, I learned, required more than just anger. It required strategy. The law is on your side, she told me during our first official meeting in her corner office. But legal cases can take years and drain your soul. What if there was another way? She handed me a business card. Dr. Maria Rodriguez, Cultural Communication Consultant. Maria works with Fortune 500 companies to help them navigate international markets. She's built a 7-figure business teaching executives that accents aren't barriers, they're bridges. I think you two should meet. Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a gleaming tower downtown, with walls covered in certificates from Harvard, Wharton, and MIT. When she spoke, her Puerto Rican accent was rich and confident, owning every syllable like a queen claiming her throne. "Let me guess," she said, after I told her my story. "Someone convinced you that sounding American was the key to success in America." I nodded, feeling suddenly small in her presence. "Sophia, I'm going to tell you something that will change your life if you let it. Your accent isn't an accident, it's an asset. Companies are losing millions of dollars because they can't effectively communicate across cultures. You're not just bilingual, you're bicultural. You understand nuances that monolingual Americans miss completely. She pulled up a presentation on her laptop. This is data from my last 5 corporate workshops. Companies that embrace linguistic diversity see 28% better performance in international markets. Companies that don't, she shrugged. They call me when they've already lost the deal. My head was spinning. But James Morrison said clients can't understand me. James Morrison is an idiot, Dr. Rodriguez said matter-of-factly, and I can prove it. Over the next month, she taught me something revolutionary: how to weaponize my authenticity, not by hiding my accent, but by owning it as a competitive advantage. When you speak Spanish in a business meeting, what happens? She asked during one of our sessions. People look uncomfortable, like I'm being rude. Wrong. People feel excluded because they realize you have access to conversations they can't understand. That's not rudeness, that's power. She was right. I started paying attention to how American executives reacted when I switched languages during international calls, how they leaned forward when I explained cultural contexts they'd never considered. I wasn't the problem. Their narrow worldview was the problem. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Rodriguez showed me the speaking industry. Sophia, there are people making 6 figures a year teaching executives how to work with international clients. You have something they don't: authentic experience, real expertise, and a story of overcoming exactly the kind of bias these companies need to address. She handed me another business card, this one for a speaker's bureau. Have you ever considered that your experience at Morrison and Associates isn't just trauma to heal from, it's content to teach from? But I didn't know then that Dr. Rodriguez had been building a network of international speakers for years. I didn't know then that companies were desperately seeking authentic voices to help them navigate an increasingly global marketplace. Most importantly, I didn't know then that my painful experience with James Morrison had given me something invaluable: credibility. I wasn't just someone teaching theory about discrimination. I was someone who'd survived it and transformed it into wisdom. That was just the beginning of how I would turn my greatest vulnerability into my greatest strength. Dr. Rodriguez wasn't just a consultant, she was a master strategist. And she had a plan that would transform me from James Morrison's victim into his biggest professional nightmare. Here's what we're going to do, she said, spreading documents across her conference table like a general planning a campaign. First, you're going to document everything about your Morrison experience. Every meeting, every microaggression, every client interaction where your cultural expertise saved the day, but you didn't get credit. The documentation process was brutal. I had to relive every humiliation, but this time I was analyzing it instead of just surviving it. Susan provided internal emails and performance reviews. I pulled together client feedback that specifically praised my cultural insights, feedback that had mysteriously never made it into my official reviews. Now, here's the brilliant part, Dr. Rodriguez continued. You're not going to sue Morrison and Associates. You're going to use them as a case study. My first speaking engagement was at a diversity conference in Minneapolis. 50 HR directors paying to learn about inclusive workplace practices. My fee was modest, $500, but the response was electric. I told my story exactly as it happened: the presentation disaster, the laughter, the systematic undermining of my confidence. But I framed it as a teachable moment about the hidden costs of linguistic bias. When James Morrison mocked my accent, he wasn't just hurting my feelings, he was cutting his company off from millions of dollars in international business opportunities.
He was telling every immigrant employee that their authentic selves weren't welcome. He was creating exactly the kind of toxic culture that drives away top talent. The questions afterward were intense, angry, transformative. These HR professionals had seen this story play out in their own companies. They wanted solutions, strategies, ways to prevent the next Sophia from being silenced. Word spread fast. Within 6 months, I was speaking at corporate conferences, university events, international business summits. My fee climbed from $500 to $2,000 to $5,000 per speech. But the real turning point came when Harvard Business School invited me to be a guest lecturer. Dr. Restrepo, the professor introduced me, is an expert on cross-cultural communication and the author of several papers on linguistic bias in corporate America. Dr. Restrepo. I'd finished my MBA part-time while building my speaking career, then fast-tracked through a doctoral program in organizational psychology. My dissertation was about accent discrimination in professional settings, based on extensive research that included, ironically, Morrison and Associates as a primary case study. The Harvard students hung on every word. These were future executives, future leaders, future James Morrisons if someone didn't intervene. I was teaching them to be better than their predecessors. Your accent tells a story. It tells the story of where you've been, what languages live in your mouth, what cultures have shaped your worldview. In a global economy, that's not a liability. It's a competitive advantage. After the lecture, a student approached me with tears in her eyes. Professor, I've been trying to eliminate my Nigerian accent for 2 years. I thought it was holding me back. Your accent, I told her, is proof that you understand markets and perspectives your American classmates can only theorize about. Don't eliminate it, leverage it. But I didn't know then that my lecture had been recorded and uploaded to YouTube. I didn't know then that it would go viral, reaching over 2 million views and launching my career into the stratosphere. Most importantly, I didn't know then that James Morrison would eventually see that video and finally understand exactly who I'd become. That was just the beginning of how completely the tables were about to turn. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was preparing for a keynote in London. My assistant announced that Morrison and Associates was requesting a consultation about their international expansion strategy. I almost laughed out loud. The same company that treated my cultural expertise as a joke now wanted to pay premium rates for exactly that knowledge. I told my assistant, tell them my consulting fee is $15,000 per day, and they'll need to commit to a minimum week-long engagement. 24 hours later, the contract was signed. Walking back into the Morrison and Associates building felt like entering a parallel universe. The same marble lobby, the same elevator, the same 20th floor, but I was a completely different person than the woman who'd fled in humiliation 3 years earlier. Susan Chen met me at the elevator, grinning like she had won the lottery.
Sophia, this is going to be the most expensive lesson James Morrison ever receives. The conference room was packed. Senior partners, department heads, international clients via video conference. And there, at the head of the table, James Morrison, looking significantly less confident than I remembered. He stood when I entered, extending his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Restrepo, thank you so much for making time for us. Your reputation precedes you. I shook his hand and looked directly into his eyes. Does it? I wasn't aware you are familiar with my work, Mr. Morrison. A flicker of something, confusion, recognition, crossed his face, but he recovered quickly. Well, yes, of course. Your expertise in cross-cultural communication is exactly what we need as we expand into Latin American markets. I smiled and opened my laptop. Excellent. Let's begin with the case study about the hidden costs of linguistic bias in corporate America. For the next hour, I systematically deconstructed everything that was wrong with Morrison and Associates' approach to international business. I used actual examples from my time there, though I didn't identify them as such initially. Imagine, I said, clicking to a slide titled Case Study: The Cost of Discrimination. A company that had an employee with native-level cultural expertise in Colombian markets. This employee identified several regulatory issues that could have cost the company millions in fines. But instead of listening to her insights, management questioned her communication skills and gradually marginalized her contributions. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The result? The company missed out on a $50 million opportunity in Bogota because they couldn't navigate the cultural nuances their own employee could have explained in her sleep. I looked directly at James. This company lost that employee to a competitor where she thrived. Meanwhile, they're still struggling to break into markets where she could have made them millions. The room was dead silent. Now, some of you might be wondering how I know this story so intimately. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a photo of the Morrison and Associates conference room, the same room where we were sitting. Because I lived it. My name is Sofia Restrepo, and 3 years ago, in this very room, I was told I sounded like a cartoon character having a stroke when I tried to present a market expansion proposal. The gasps were audible. James Morrison's face went white as a sheet. Mr. Morrison, do you remember that meeting? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Because I remember it perfectly. I remember every laugh, every dismissive comment, every time my expertise was ignored because of my accent. And now, ironically, you're paying me more in 1 week than you paid me in an entire year for the exact same knowledge you once mocked. I stood up, gathering my materials with theatrical precision. Gentlemen, ladies, this concludes today's session on the cost of linguistic bias. Tomorrow, we'll discuss strategies for creating inclusive international business practices, assuming, of course, that you're ready to listen this time. But I didn't know then that half the room was already planning to poach me for their own companies. I didn't know then that James Morrison would spend the next week trying to figure out how to repair his reputation. Most importantly, I didn't know then that this confrontation would become the centerpiece of my most requested keynote speech. That was just the beginning of how completely I'd reclaim my power. Which brings us back to where we started, that convention center stage in Chicago with James Morrison introducing me as the keynote speaker for his company's annual leadership summit. He said, "Please welcome Dr. Sofia Restrepo." I walked onto that stage wearing a red dress and confidence like armor, my heels clicking a rhythm that sounded like victory. 1,200 business leaders, including half the senior management from Morrison and Associates, waiting to hear what I had to say. "Good morning," I began, my Colombian accent rich and unashamed. "My name is Sofia Restrepo, and I want to tell you about the day someone told me I would never succeed in America because of the way I spoke." I told them the whole story, the presentation disaster, the systematic discrimination, the way I'd almost lost myself trying to sound like someone else. But I also told them about the transformation, about Dr. Rodriguez, about discovering that my accent wasn't a flaw to hide, but a strength to celebrate. The man who mocked my accent, I said, making eye contact with James in the front row, thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he launched my career as one of the most sought-after speakers in corporate America. The applause was thunderous, standing ovation. 1,200 business leaders, including half the senior management from Morrison and Associates, waiting to hear what I had to say. After my speech, James approached the stage with something that might have been an apology forming on his lips. "Dr. Restrepo, I wanted to say." I handed him my business card, the same gesture he'd made when he hired me, but with the power dynamic completely reversed. "Mr. Morrison, if you're interested in booking me for future events, my speaking fee has just increased to $25,000 plus expenses." He took the card with hands that trembled slightly. "Sophia, I owe you an apology. What I said, what I did, it was wrong. I was wrong." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the intimidating boss who'd once destroyed my confidence,
but a small man who let prejudice blind him to opportunity. James, I said quietly, your apology doesn't undo the damage, but your check for $20,000 helps fund scholarships for immigrant students studying business. So, in a way, your discrimination is still paying dividends, just not for you.
6 months later, Morrison and Associates was acquired by a larger firm. James was restructured out of his position. Susan Chen recommended me for the cultural consultation on the transition, at my full rate, of course. Today, I speak at conferences around the world, teaching executives that diversity isn't just morally right, it's financially smart. My book, The Power of Different Voices, is required reading at business schools from Harvard to Stanford. I've built a 7-figure company based on the very things someone once told me would hold me back. Sometimes late at night in hotel rooms across the globe, I think about that scared young woman who almost let someone else's ignorance silence her forever. I think about all the Sophia Restrepels out there right now, being told their accents are too thick, their voices are too different, their authentic selves aren't professional enough. To them, I say this: your accent is not a flaw to fix. It's proof that you contain multitudes, that you bridge worlds, that you carry stories and perspectives that monolingual people can only dream of accessing. In a global economy, that's not just valuable, it's irreplaceable. The best revenge isn't just succeeding despite discrimination. It's succeeding because of what discrimination taught you about resilience, authenticity, and the power of refusing to be diminished. My accent opens doors now instead of closing them. My voice commands $20,000 fees instead of apologetic whispers. My story transforms audiences instead of just surviving meetings. James Morrison thought he was teaching me to know my place. Instead, he taught me to create my own place, at the head of the table, behind the podium, at the center of conversations that matter. Some people try to make you smaller to make themselves feel bigger. The real victory is growing so large that their small-mindedness becomes irrelevant. And that's how a cruel insult turned into the sweetest revenge. The man who mocked my voice was forced to hand me a check, proof that the very thing he tried to destroy became my greatest weapon. If you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or torn down, remember this: revenge doesn't always come with anger. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is standing taller while your enemy chokes on their own words. This was just one chapter in the endless library of karmic justice. Yours could be next.